Hey there guys, so recently I got this really solid deal for this HP EliteDesk mini PC on Amazon for just $150. Now the listing said it was a Ryzen 5 2400GE with 8 GB of RAM. But actually getting this system, it ended up being a Ryzen 5 Pro 2400G along with 16 GB of RAM. Actually getting into this little mini PC is a lot easier than you think. You literally just unscrew the little screw back here and you just pop off the front and you now have access to the system itself. Now it actually does have the M.2 slot underneath this cage right here, which also is a 2.5-inch storage slot. Now it has this fan attached to it, so you can't just throw in whatever you want in there. You'd have to remove this, and the system does complain when you do remove it, but there is a setting to disable that. But in general, it's a really rock solid system, and for the specs, paying only $150, I was actually really impressed. So we're going to take a look at how exactly it performs in games. But before that, we're going to take a look at it just in terms of size next to the Beelink SCR5. You can see that it is a shorter system, but in general, it is just wider, so it's not as small, but the level of performance that it has is pretty impressive for the price that I paid. Now starting off the game comparison, we're taking a look at Batman Arkham Knight running on this system at the full 1080p resolution. Now you can see that we're running on a Radeon Vega 11, so it actually does have more GPU cores than most modern Ryzen 5 APUs. But pay attention to the clock speed. It is noticeably lower. Now this is capped out at 25 watts. Now that's a system limitation. If we were to remove the CPU in here and put it on a normal motherboard, we could actually overclock this and get some nice performance out of it. But as it is with this system, it does not allow you to do that, at least with the built-in motherboard. But the CPU is at least socketed, so you can remove it. The level of performance that we're looking at here at the full 1080p resolution is more around a 30 FPS gaming experience with 1% lows that dip below that, but they don't go down too low to overall ruin the experience. So it is pretty impressive considering that we are running it at the full 1080p resolution, though it is at the lowest in-game graphics settings. Of course, if we drop things down to 900p, we do get a nice bump in the overall performance here, and the experience does become noticeably nicer. As you can see here, the level of performance that we get when we actually drop down to 900p is a lot closer to around a 45 FPS gaming average throughout most of it, with 1% lows that for the most part actually stay at a very reasonable range. It actually felt really nice to play like this. I jumped into the campaign for a little bit and was just going around just beating up thugs around the place, and in general the performance was really rock solid. And visually speaking, even though we're at the lowest in-game graphics settings, it still looks really decent. And the level of performance that we got out of this, especially at just 25 watts, was really impressive. And you'll see that the GPU is clocking up to its maximum speed. Now you can't see the GPU utilization just because these older APUs actually have a problem with MSI Afterburner reporting the usage wrong. It pretty much says that it's using around 10,000%, which is just completely unrealistic. It's just something that's always been broken on these older APUs. It doesn't do anything to affect the overall performance, but you'll see here that the GPU is at maximum clock speed and the CPU itself is not being overly utilized or anything like that. It's really rock solid. So already impressive levels of performance. And after the experience with that game, I thought that we were going to get something at least a little bit better in SpiderMan Remastered. Here you can see it running at the full 1080p resolution with all of the lowest in-game graphics settings, pretty much the identical settings that were used in the previous video where we took a look at this on the SRE5 with the 5600H. So you can definitely see that there is a noticeable difference in the overall performance. Where 1080p was at least somewhat doable in the SCR5, here it is really just a PowerPoint presentation on steroids, and it overall was not a pleasant experience. And unfortunately, dropping all the way down to 720p doesn't really salvage the overall experience just because the 1% lows suffer pretty noticeably. We do get closer to a 30 FPS average a lot of the time, and in a lot of moments it can feel pretty smooth, but as you're swinging around and you're actually getting into some intense action, it can be pretty brutal. So I would say that this is really pushing what you can actually do on this system. I would actually be curious to see how this would perform if we took the CPU and put it on a system that had a RAM that we could actually adjust the timings on, and if we could actually overclock the GPU itself. So I might actually end up picking up a motherboard that will let us do that. But as it stands with this mini PC, this game is just a little too too out of reach. Though if you're really desperate to play it, you can actually get away with it. It's just not going to be an amazing experience. Now, the next game that I tried out on the system was God of War. Now, this is actually running with the in-game render resolution set to 50% of 1080p. I'm not using FSR or any upscaler like that. The reason being is that if you set FSR to the performance preset or anything like that, it actually looks way worse than if you just lower the in-game resolution to the lowest that it will let you go. It actually ends up looking like a noticeably clearer image. Of course, it's not perfect, but FSR really can make things look pretty bad at the lowest settings. So in a lot of situations, you're kind of just better off lowering the in-game render resolution and just rolling with that. But in general, the level of performance that we were able to squeeze out like this is at least a 30 FPS average. Though our 1% lows aren't remarkable, it is still pretty impressive levels of performance, especially considering that for $150, it's kind of hard to find any gaming system that will perform this well that isn't a old console. And considering I was able to pick this up on Amazon for just $150, I'm really impressed with the kind of games that you can actually play on here. It is of course an older chip, but the Vega architecture still continues to live on to this day, with 7000 series APUs also coming with Vega, though at this point AMD has abandoned the Vega name and continues to just call it Radeon. At the end of the day, the fundamental architecture for a certain section of the 7000 series is still going to be Vega. It's going to be a mix of essentially of RDNA and Vega. So in a lot of ways, this old APU still has some relevancy in the market today, since it's not going to be that far from what is going to still be available to this day. So of course, architecture improvements, as well as improvements in process nodes and the clock speeds that these iGPUs can reach, has made a noticeable improvement, as you can see, compared to the results that we would get on more modern APUs. Now, another game that I took a look at is Days Gone, another game that is running at 60% of the in-game render resolution. I didn't drop it all the way down to 50 just because 50 was making a lot of the edges of things look noticeably worse. 60% was about as low as I could really go, where I could stomach the visual quality of it, though still running everything with the lowest in-game settings is pretty brutal just in terms of how everyone looks in the game. And it can really take away from a lot of scenes where if something dramatic is happening, you kind of lose some of the impact of it when all of the players kind of just look like potatoes. So while we're able to get actually a really nice level of performance out of this, with 1% lows being at a 30 FPS range and our average essentially being in the mid 40s, and visually speaking, it was such a huge impact that I realistically wouldn't play the game like this. But if you've just been very interested in picking this up and playing it, and this is all you have, you can actually get away with playing with it. So I would consider it a win with an asterisk, where it just depends on how much of a visual quality impact you're willing to take, because there are a lot of games that even at the lowest settings can look really nice. For example, Batman Arkham Knight does look really nice even at the lowest settings. This game, not so much. So I decided to also test out a game that had a little bit more relevancy around the time this APU was released, and we're taking a look at Fallout 4. Now, this is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, though visually speaking, it still looks pretty decent, and you can pretty much get away with setting the texture quality a little higher because of the fact that we are working with 16 gigabytes of RAM. But in general, the level of performance that we're looking at is pretty decent, with the FPS pretty much being in the 40 range, and our 1% lows never dipping below a level where I would think it would be unplayable. It was very consistent, and I really had a pretty enjoyable time on this game. I'm very used to playing the Fallout games on consoles, since that was pretty much my childhood, and in a lot of those console situations, you weren't even playing these games at a 30 FPS. A lot of the times it would dip below that. So this level of performance, especially at a full 1080p resolution, is actually really nice, and I had a very good time playing this. So I would consider this one a solid win for this system. Of course, taking a look at a more relevant title to today's market, we're taking a look at Fortnite, which of course got its update to the Unreal 5.1 engine, and with it came some pretty noticeable performance impacts on older games, but we did finally get the performance API out of the beta phase. Now, Fortnite is one of those games that has a lot, and I mean a lot, of micro stutter in it, and you have to play a few rounds before things really start start to level off. So this was around my 4th game of playing on this system, and I gotta say that the experience still wasn't incredible, especially when you first land. The 1% lows would take an impact, but if you take a look at the frame times, they're at least consistent enough, and you don't really notice too many major spikes here and there. Now, when you first start out, you will have games where you will have some pretty brutal stutters, and in general, it could make the experience really bad, especially for a competitive game like this. So I would say that Fortnite's one of those games where you can play on here only out of sheer desperation, and if you're willing to drop the in-game resolution, because this is with the performance API at the full 1080p resolution with 100% resolution scaling, if you drop it down to around 80%, you can get a nice boost, especially in your averages and 1% lows, though it won't be anything substantial. Still, in general, it does make the experience a little bit more playable, but in those situations where you're getting into long range battles, that lower resolution might be kind of a detriment. So it really just depends on what you're willing to stomach in these types of games. I can understand that people that play battle royales might just want the highest FPS possible, and this might just be too low for you to really have a good time. And the final game that I wanted to take a look at today was Valorant, a game that I play pretty frequently, though I'm absolutely terrible at it. And this system was not doing me any favors here because the 1% lows were noticeably bad here. Our averages were pretty decent, but the 1% lows being in the 40 range meant that we were dropping below 60 a lot of the time. And in general, it did make the experience not feel as smooth as I'm used to playing, though I wouldn't say that it was to the point where it was completely unplayable. I'm sure if I was a better player of this game, I would have had a better time, but it was just one of those things where it was kind of a brutal experience in some cases. In general, though, it was a much better experience than playing Fortnite, and I would say that you can actually comfortably get away with playing on here if you don't have the FPS counter on there. I think that the vast majority of people, especially people trying to get into the game, won't really notice any performance impact. So just in general, I think it's one of those things where if you're used to playing on a better setup, then maybe, yeah, you'll have something to complain about here. But I think that the vast majority of people, especially someone that is interested in picking up a system like this, you're going to find yourself actually having a pretty rock solid time here. In general, I'm pretty impressed with the level of performance that this system actually has, and it's not the only benefit to it. The I/O that it has is actually really impressive. Every single USB port that we have here is a USB 3.0 USB port. And with the amount that it actually has, 6 full-size ones and a USB-C, we get really impressive levels of performance out of this just in terms of expandability. Now, we also do have a modular port here that can be swapped out, but this one comes with HDMI, and we do get 2 display ports. Really nice I/O when it comes to that. In general, I really love this system. For the $150 that I spent, I really don't have a lot to complain about. And it even has 2 audio ports in the front, one of them being just audio and the other one being a mix of mic and headphone out. So you can actually have 2 different headsets hooked up to this. So you can have one go into your speakers, the other one go into your headset. Really rock solid I/O. And if we actually compare that to the other mini PCs that I have, being the Beelink SCR5s, the one with the 5560U and the 5600H, the level of performance that we're getting out of here is nowhere comparable to the 2 really. Both of them perform noticeably better, especially in a lot of more modern titles, but in older AAA games or esports titles, all of them are going to do a rock solid job, especially if you're looking to play things like Minecraft or Roblox. And for $150, it is really impressive levels of performance because you can get a nice monitor to go with this for essentially the price of just the cheapest unit. And the I/O is really impressive by comparison. Even in the best one here, we're looking at 2 HDMI, 1 USB 3 in the back, a USB 2.0 in the back, and the Ethernet in the front. We're looking at 2 USB 3 and the USB-C with just a normal headphone jack out. So very limited I/O in comparison, but we do get noticeably better performance. And of course, the version with the 5560U is missing the USB 3.0 in the back. So the I/O is undefeated when it comes to the price point, especially because a lot of the systems that you look at that are mini PCs in this price range, you're looking at Intel Celerons, and the I/O is going to be extremely limited as well as the performance. So I really like this system, and even going all the way up to $200, what I got out of this was really impressive. Now, keep in mind that the specs that were listed were not the ones that I got. I got a better system than what was advertised to me. That might not be the case for you, but even if you get the more limited specs specs. It's a really easy upgrade to do if you only get 8 gigabytes of RAM with it, and you're still going to come out on top when it comes to the amount that you're going to be paying in comparison to other systems. So if you're interested in picking it up, there is a link down below, and the next video that we're going to be doing with this system is going to be doing a head-to-head comparison with these two specific mini PCs to see what the generational improvement has actually been. But anyways, I will catch you guys in the next one.